بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم. Subhanallah, beginning this conversation about psychology from the Islamic perspective, and beginning this conference with a topic that focuses on our well-being, on our mental health, on our physical health, and on our spiritual health, is a critical turning point in our communities. Beginning this evening and preceding this session, watching the images on the screen of the children in Yemen, looking at the faces of those who are struggling, listening to the dua of the beautiful asking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the shifa of the sheikh who is in surgery or has recently completed surgery. In just the span of a few minutes, we were able to see, to feel, to recognize, to understand something that is universal: pain, hurt, hardship, difficulty, struggle. There is not one of us in here in this room today, there is not one of us out there in the halls of this conference that has not been tested in some way. Whether that test is in our health, in our wealth, in our children, or the greatest test of all that we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to never test us with, in the steadfastness of our deen. Now, why are we here to speak about psychology from the Islamic perspective? I think it's incredibly interesting that many times people will refer to the work that I do in the field that I am in to psychology. And we often, use those terms haphazardly: therapist, counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, mental health specialist. We kind of throw them up in a box and mix them up and we say, oh, it's all the same thing. But realistically speaking, my doctorate degree is in family studies and intervention strategies. The focus of the years of my study and the work that I've done, and the work that we do at Cornerstone, our counseling centers, really focuses on an incredibly holistic approach. We focus on interventions that help those who are struggling, who are going through pain, who are being tested with hardship. Interventions that do not lie only in the psyche, which is the focus of psychology, but interventions that are rooted first in the spiritual, then in the intellectual, then in the relational and the communicative relationships that we built, and then in the psychology, in the psyche of the human being. Because we are not comprised of just one part. We are not just the mind. We are the mind, we are the heart, we are the body, we are all those elements that come together, that are part of the soul that is linked to the Creator. So when we look at that holistic approach, when we look at the elements of what it makes or what it takes to make a person, we recognize that the Western view of psychology doesn't always allow us that flexibility. If we are working only on the psyche, then we are often working from a psychological perspective that is rooted in the early days of psychology, which believed that man, human being, is broken, that there is something wrong with humans, and so we must fix it. And we must fix it by looking at the psyche and rebuilding it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that each and every one of us is born ala fitra. We are born good. We are born whole. We are born complete. We are born with a connection to the Creator. And yet it is somehow in our journeys in this world that we do sometimes become broken, that we do struggle, that we do face difficulty. But in Surah Al-Baqarah, in verse 155, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, and we will surely test you with something of fear, of hunger, and of loss. Let's take a look at each of these aspects that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us we will be tested with. Because it is a test of who we are, a test of our connection with the Creator. And the first test that we were reminded that we will encounter is the test of fear. For all of us who have experienced anxiety, for all of us who have struggled with taking the next steps in our lives because fear has paralyzed us, with all of us who have been afraid at some point or another, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has reminded us that this is part of our test. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us example after example of how we can live through this fear, how we can recover from these tests of fear and hunger and loss, whether it is a loss of lives, of wealth, or of fruits. And we look to the Quran and we begin to see these examples. One of the early examples that we see of a prophet, alayhi salam, who was tested, is in the test of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. And when we began this talk, as every talk that you will probably listen to in this conference, as every engagement that you have with something that is difficult, we often begin with the dua of Musa alayhi salam. And this dua of Musa alayhi salam in Surah Dawah comes at a time when Musa alayhi salam is commanded by Allah to do something difficult, to take a step that may invoke within him fear, to speak to Fir'aun, to stop oppression. And it is in this moment when Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam is tested with this sense of fear that he turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rabbi shrah li sadri. He asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open for him his chest. وَيَسِّرْ لِي أَمْرِي, and make my task easy. Because it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who promises us إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرٍ, that there will be ease with difficulty. But we must turn and ask for that ease. وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةَ مِنْ لِسَانِي, and remove the knot from my tongue. Because Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam used to have a bit of a lisp when he would speak. It was a difficulty, it was a struggle, it was a test that he had. And it was a test that made him afraid in that moment of facing the oppressor without the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يَفْقَهُ قَوْلِي, so that they may understand. Because one of the most difficult struggles that we see so often when people who are broken, who are struggling, who are engaging through moments in their life, trying to overcome anxiety, panic disorders, OCD, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, and a whole wealth of other difficulties. One of the hardest struggles that we see is when they say no one understands. No one knows how hard it is. No one gets it. People tell me, pray 2 rak'ahs and you'll be fine. My parents tell me it is because your iman is weak and that's why you're always afraid. And yet here in the Quran we have Musa alayhi salam in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asking Allah to help him so that they may understand. Because when we find a lack of understanding in those closest to us, when we are struggling with a difficulty that is particularly rooted in our mental health, one of the greatest heartaches that we see is a lack of understanding. And yet, Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam doesn't stop there. He continues in asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَاجْعَلْ لِي وَزِيرًا مِنْ أَهْلِي, and appoint for me a minister or an advisor or someone to be by my side from my family. Think of your own family members. Think of the ones who are struggling. Maybe the ones who have doubts about the deen. Maybe the ones who are locked in depression. Maybe the ones that have anxiety that is so severe that it causes them to have difficulty in their everyday relationships. Think of those family members and think of Musa alayhi salam, who asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to appoint for him someone from his family to be by his side in his most difficult moment. And he asked that person to be Harun akhi, his brother Harun, so that they can go through this journey together, because none of us are meant to go through those tests that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about in Surah Al-Baqarah. None of us are meant to go through them alone. We are meant to go through them with those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in our path, with those that He has brought near to us, whether they are family or like family, whether they are those who we go to seek help from, specialists. Remember that cocktail we talked about in the beginning, the psychologists, the counselors, the therapists, those who are able to guide us. Now we look to the Quran also, and we see another beautiful example of the struggle of someone who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us is one of the chosen women of Jannah. And we look to Surah Maryam, where we see Maryam alayha salam, when she is going through one of the most difficult moments in her life, when she is in the pains of childbirth, when she knows the heaviness of this test that she is being tested with. A test that we all know is a blessing not only to Maryam alayha salam, but to all the universe. And yet it is in that moment of that test when Maryam alayha salam says, يا ليتني مت قبل هذا وكنت نسيا منسيا. Oh, if only I had passed before this pain, I had been of those who were forgotten. And in that moment, when Maryam alayha salam is going through such hardship and difficulty, the response from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite mercy, the response from Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim is a response that is filled with rahmah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls to Maryam, min tahtiha. From beneath her, He calls to her and says, there is a stream that runs near you. Drink from that stream. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Maryam to do something. هِزِّ إِلَيْكِ بِجِذْعِ النَّخْلَةِ. Shake the trunk of the palm tree so that the dates may fall and you may eat from them. How many times when our friends, when our teenagers, when our students are going through difficulty, maybe the difficulty is a bad test grade. Maybe the difficulty is getting caught with marijuana. Maybe the difficulty is issues of sexuality that they are struggling with. Maybe the difficulty is a parent who abuses them. Maybe the difficulty is something that is so hard they have not been able to speak about it with anyone. And when this person says, I wish I were dead, how do we respond? Do we respond with rahmah? Do we respond with an active guidance? Do we guide them towards doing something as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided Maryam alayha salam to shake the trunk of the palm tree, to do something? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Maryam alayha salam to not speak. Because how many times when someone is going through difficulty do we tell them, talk to me, tell me what's going on? Oh, I can't help you if you don't tell me. Khalas, I tried, you're not talking. How many times do we turn to the Quran and look to the example of Maryam alayha salam when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells her not to speak? Sometimes we need to just feel. Sometimes we need to just sit with the one who is struggling. Sometimes we need to just listen if they want to speak, and to listen to their silence even when they don't want to speak. We see another example in the Quran of our beloved Prophet, the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who we know was tested. He was tested with difficulty after difficulty. But one of the difficulties that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam was tested with, that was an internal struggle, came at a time when the revelation had stopped being sent to him for a brief period of time. When the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam quietly wondered whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was displeased with him when he did not receive that revelation that he grew to love and seek. And so the verses of Surah Dawah were revealed. Verses that brought comfort to the heart of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam in a way and a time that no one else might have fully understood, because no one else could truly understand the beauty of the revelation being revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam except for he who had experienced it. And so in the midst of his sadness, of his worry and his wondering, and his fear of whether or not Allah was displeased with him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent him reassurance, sent him the beautiful verses of Surah Dawah. The surah which begins with a reminder of the light that comes in morning, and reminds us of the night that covers in darkness. The verses of a surah that speak to the heart of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and that can speak to our heart as well. That this world is not the end. That there is an akhirah in which we will experience life without those tests that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described to us. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not forsaken nor detested the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam in those moments when the revelation was not revealed. A surah in which there are reminders. أَلَمْ يَجِدْكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى وَوَجَدَكَ ضَالًّا فَهَدَى. Did we not find you as an orphan and give you refuge? Were you not lost and guided? These are words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to the beloved Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But they're words that are meant to help us as well. Words that are meant to guide us. Words that are meant to uplift us. Because there are moments in our lives where it will feel like we are covered in night and in darkness. There are moments in our lives where we will wonder whether or not the light will come. There are moments in our lives where we may ask and question, has Allah forsaken us? And we repeat these verses and we see that this is the meaning of the verse in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. Do not ever despair from the mercy of Allah, because He is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. He is Al-Hakam Al-Adl. He is Al-Hakim, and He has a wisdom that goes far beyond the wisdom we may think we have here in this dunya. It is a wisdom that carries us through the most difficult of our moments. A wisdom that helps us in the moments when we are tested with fear and with hunger and with loss. Because those are parts of the dunya. And it's parts of that cleansing of ourselves so that we can get closer and closer to that fitrah with which we are born. And so with every difficulty that we go through, we are reminded of the hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam that reminds us, Amr al-mu'min gharib, that the state of the believer is strange. If the believer experiences something good, he says Alhamdulillah. And if the believer experiences something difficult, he still says Alhamdulillah. And we see this in the example of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, who was tested with the fear of being placed inside a deep well by his own siblings, who was tested with being thrown into a prison for something he didn't do, who was tested in so many different ways. And yet with each test, it was a getting closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a getting closer and closer to understanding his purpose as a prophet. And we see this in the example of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, who was tested by his own father being the one that leads the people of the town to throw his own son into the fire. Sometimes the hardest tests that we experience, the most difficult aspects that can affect our mental health and well-being, often come from our own family members. How many of us are adults walking around in bodies that were sexually abused or molested as children? How many of us are adults who have experienced at the hands of those that we thought loved us the most, our spouse, our parents, our siblings? How many of us have experienced dhulm, oppression, pain, hardship? Sometimes it is those that we think are closest to us that inflict upon us the greatest of tests. But we have the example of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam to see that even that test that comes from those who are closest to us is a test that is meant to teach us, is a test that is meant to bring us closer and closer to the Creator. If we turn to it with that sense of Alhamdulillah. You know, a lot of the work that we do at Cornerstone is work that is difficult in hearing the stories of trauma. Trauma that is very heavy, trauma that is often interlaced with difficulty that has happened to someone without any wrongdoing of their own. And I want to share with you an example of one of the aspects that we try to address when we look at psychology from the Islamic perspective. And remember, when we look at psychology from an Islamic perspective, it is no longer limited to a Freudian or a perspective that is focused on the broken self, but it is instead looking at the levels of the spiritual well-being, the intellectual, the relational, and the psychological, and bringing that all together. And in doing so, we often look to what it is within the inside of a person that motivates them, that pushes them into different areas that may cause struggles and difficulties. So we know, of course, when we look at Freud, and again, anyone who's taken a Psych 101 class has probably heard of the id, the ego, and the superego. And yet when we turn to our Quran, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the guidance of the levels of the nafs years before Freud ever existed. That within each of us, we are reminded that there is a nafs al-ammara, the basis self. And there is a nafs al-lawama, the conscious self. And there is the nafs al-mutma'inna, the self that we all strive towards. Now in Western psychology that is not filtered through the spiritual or the Islamic lens, we often see this push towards feed your desires, do what makes you feel good. Your rules are the only rules that matter. And this is a corruption of the nafs because it is a push towards the nafs al-ammara. It is a push towards the basis self in which we are encouraged to explore the most animalistic of our instincts. And so when we see youth today struggling with their sexuality, when we see youth today struggling with their gender, when we see youth today struggling with so many difficulties that they are being told to follow up with, to live their lives in a certain way, we often see it linked to that nafs al-ammara, to feed the basis self. But we know that in the Quran we are guided towards an understanding that there exists within us a nafs al-lawwama that helps us mitigate or understand the influence of the nafs al-ammara. And that it is us striving towards that nafs al-mutma'inna, that contented self in which we recognize that the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than any rulings that society may put upon us, is greater than any immoral types of activities that society may encourage us towards. Because it is reaching that nafs al-mutma'inna, that stage of contentment, that allows us to return to that state of fitrah, that allows us to return to a state of purity. When in Surah Al-Fajr in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that there will come a day where He will call out to that nafs al-mutma'inna, inviting that nafs, the contented self, into Jannah, while the self is contented with the hikmah of Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with that nafs. Now oftentimes when we have people that come to our offices asking about anxiety or depression or other mental health difficulties that they're struggling with, they'll often ask, is this a test from Allah? And the answer is yes, our entire lives are a test in which we are meant to return to Allah and to worship Allah. But then often they will ask, is this a test from Allah because I have done something wrong? Is this a punishment from Allah? And we want to ensure that when we look at our mental health and our well-being, that we don't falsely equate this concept of a punishment in the dunya with a test that we may have. Because a test is something that every single one of us will go through. And maybe when we look at the screen and we see those who are hungry in Yemen, when we see those who are struggling in China, when we see those who are being tortured in Syria, when we see those who are going through tests with a capital T, we may think, I shouldn't be depressed. I don't know why I feel this way. And we'll often try to minimize the emotions that we're going through. But if you are struggling with depression, if you are struggling with anxiety, if you are struggling with an OCD disorder, if you are struggling with paranoia, if you are struggling with bipolar, your test is a test that was tailored just for you. Just as the test of hunger, the test of torture, the test of difficulty and estrangement and forced migration has been a test for someone else. And it is not that your test is any less difficult. It is that your test is designed for you. And this is why that verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. It is a clear guidance that we will never be tested with a test that's greater than we can bear. The one who is tested with hunger, that is a test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows they can bear. The one who is tested with depression, that is a test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows you can bear. It is a test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide for you the guidance to help you through it. Just as He will provide the organizations and the donors and the supporters that may help those who are struggling with hunger. Just as He will provide the doctors and the nurses and the specialists that will help the one who is struggling in their health, in their sickness. But we must truly believe that our test is a test that we can get through, because that is what it means when we are reminded, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. when we despair from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is when we say there's no hope. It is when we say I give up. It is when we say I'm done, I can't do this anymore. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that we may have those moments. And this is why we're reminded of Maryam alayha salam in the Quran. But it is in those moments that we need the reminders of the Haruns that are in our life, of the friends of the Sahaba, of those who are close to us that can help us through it. Again, we look at the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and we look at the year of sorrow, Aam al-Huzn, in which he was tested with loss. We've spoken of the test of fear. We've spoken of the test of hunger, in which we know that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam and Khadija radiallahu anha would sometimes be so hungry that they would tie stones on their stomach to calm the hunger pangs. And then the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam was also tested with loss. In that year of sorrow, when he had lost his beloved Khadija radiallahu anha, when he had lost his beloved uncle, and the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam felt that the faraj would come when he would leave Mecca and enter into the town of Ta'if. And yet when he entered into the town of Ta'if, wanting to speak to the people there of La ilaha illallah, wanting to reach them with the words of Allah, he was ridiculed, he was harassed, he was pelted with rocks and with garbage. And the rocks tore at the body of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam until the blood ran from his body and coagulated on the sandals of his feet, so that the sandals stuck to the bottom of his feet. And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who had been tested in so many ways, left Ta'if and rested in a meadow. And it was in that moment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam Jibreel alayhi salam, who said to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, just say the word, and Allah can command the angel of the mountains that surround Ta'if to bring those mountains together and crush the people therein. And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam said no. He said no because maybe the children of Ta'if will believe, or maybe the children of Ta'if will believe. This is hope. This is faith. This is the strength of Iman, that even in the most difficult of moments, we see ad-duha, we see the light, despite al-layl, despite the darkness of the night. I want to share with you an example, a story, a situation of someone who had gone through great difficulty. And he's given his permission for me to speak of his story, because it's one that I think many of us can learn from. As I mentioned before, some of the work that we do at Cornerstone, a great deal of the work we do is with refugee clients. And many times our refugee clients come to us speaking of incredible pain, difficulty that sometimes we listen to, and it is hard for us as interventionists to be able to work through it at times. There was a particular family that we were working with. It was a mother and a father and a son who was older. He was a young adult. He was in his 20s. They were able to escape from Syria after all of the siblings in the family were killed, except for this one son. And they escaped, and they had bounced around from refugee camp to refugee camp in Turkey and Jordan, and then finally they were able to come to the US. They came to the US and they began to settle in. They had experienced fear in the war. They had experienced hunger, days on end where they wouldn't eat anything at all in the camps. And they had experienced loss of pretty much their entire family except for this one son. As they settled into the US and they began to make some headway into living here, the father and the mother were older, and so they had difficulties getting about. But the son was able to obtain employment. The son was able to learn English. The son was someone who we would use as, a model refugee citizen, someone who had excelled in finding his path here. Now, they were doing well, and we thought they were a refugee family, that they had worked through their trauma. Now, the gentleman, the young adult, we started getting phone calls from his employer saying that he wasn't anywhere to be found, saying that, he wasn't working well the way that he used to work. And this was, about a year or so into him being in the workplace. And then we started hearing from the mother and the father that they were very worried about him, that he wasn't sleeping, that they just couldn't find him for hours on end. And so eventually we brought the family back in to speak to them. In speaking to the gentleman, and this wasn't just in one session, but session after session after session, it was clear that he was struggling with a difficulty, that he had fallen into depression, that there was fear in his eyes when he spoke to us, that there was a sadness in the way that he spoke. And one of the beautiful ni'mas of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that protects us in our mental health sometimes is that sometimes we may experience something very traumatic, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause us to forget parts of the trauma, will cause us to feel like something happened but we're not quite sure what. And it is as if in our minds there are these little boxes, and we seal away the memories sometimes of difficulty in those boxes. The memories of a difficult interaction with a parent, the memories of a difficult situation with a spouse, the memories of something very hard that we went through, and we put it away in the box. And sometimes putting it away in these boxes protects us until that time when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that we are ready to face that trauma, knows that we are ready to go back in time and understand that test and know why we went through this test. So as we sat with this young man and we spoke to him session after session, we began to notice that each time he'd come, his hands would be red and bloody, and the peeling of his skin showed evidence that something was happening. And so we began to dig a little bit deeper, and we found that this young man who had gone through so much hunger, loss, and pain, and had never buckled, had been the strength for his family, was now struggling with a form of OCD. And this OCD, which we see quite frequently, is an OCD known as scrupulosity. And just recently, in the DSM-5 standards, which is the psychology standards of different types of mental health illness, just recently scrupulosity has now been listed under the OCD disorders. Now what's interesting is scrupulosity is a disorder in which someone begins to channel their trauma into religious fervor. So someone who prays consistently and can't stop praying. Someone who sits in dhikr and does it to an extreme in which they can't function in any other way. Someone who makes wudu consistently because they don't think that they're clean. And so it turned out that this young man, a few months prior, his appendix had burst. And when his appendix had burst, the pain of his appendix and the blood that he saw at the surgery opened up one of his boxes. And it was a box of something that had happened to him when he was a child, when he was raped. And it was a memory that despite all of the other hardship that he had gone through in his life, despite the war, despite leaving his home, despite his siblings being killed in front of him, it was a memory that he had sealed away because he was able to stand strong in all of those other tests. And suddenly this memory had resurfaced. And so what he found himself doing was constantly making wudu hours on end. He'd be standing at work, and the memory would come back to him, and he would leave his work post in order to make wudu hour upon hour, washing himself over and over and over again, thinking that this was the only way that he could cleanse himself. And we go back to our deen, And we understand the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in guiding us towards a place of moderation. When the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam was approached by 3 people, 3 men who said, we want to be the best in our faith. And the first said, I will pray all night and I will never sleep. And the second said, I will fast and I will never break my fast. And the third said, I will never marry. And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who would never get upset by a question, who would always answer with that patience. In the narration of this hadith, we are told that there was a blue vein on the blessed white forehead of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And when he came to answer these men, the vein began to throb slightly to show that this was something of agitation, something important that he needed to respond to. And he said to these 3 men, I pray some of the night and I sleep some of the night. I fast some of the days and I break my fast. And I marry. So how can you be better than that? And it is a foreshadowing of an understanding that just today, Western psychology is beginning to label and identify. That scrupulosity is a mental health illness in which we can take our religion to a point in which it can be damaging to us. And so this young man, whose memory box had opened, had turned to the deen, but in a way that was extreme. And so he couldn't eat, he couldn't function, he couldn't focus. When he would stand to pray, he would feel like he was not clean enough because of what had happened to him. And he would stop his prayer and return to wudu. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that that memory box would open at a time and in a moment when his family, his parents were there for him. He had 7 siblings besides him, 7 siblings that were all killed or had died in the camps. And now it was just him and his parents. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that that memory box would open when he had access to interventionists, to psychologists, to psychiatrists, when he had that help and that guidance that helped him through it. And alhamdulillah, I can say that this young man now, after months and months and months of therapy, consistent therapy and interventions, after taking the medication that was prescribed to him by the psychiatrist, alhamdulillah, he has returned to work. He is working through the traumatic memories. He is learning to understand his why, because he knows that even that test that he experienced as a child is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is a test that will bring him closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants each and every one of us those who can help us, can guide us, can understand us. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows each of us to have a heart of softness, that can understand the difficulties of others, that can never belittle the tests of those around us, that can never belittle our own tests. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to find those helpers, those who He has sent to us as pathways of guidance, as ways to assist us through our difficulties, because we were never meant to go through our tests alone. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses the organizers of this conference, the volunteers, and all of the attendees for allowing us to address such an important topic that inshallah we'll continue to talk about throughout the weekend. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم